My name is Philip Osano. I'm the Center Director for the Stockholm Environment Institute Africa Center, which is based in Nairobi. The Stockholm Environment Institute is an organization that conducts research on environment and development issues. My current work in environment conservation deals with the issue of science and policy. So it's basically how does the research on environment informs policy action. And that's happening on a number of areas and topics and sectors. Biodiversity is one of those sectors, but also climate change, agriculture, and water management, for example. I studied for undergraduate degree in environmental science and a master's degree in conservation biology. I was actually sponsored through the Tropical Biology Association program for my master's. And I looked at the economics of conservation of biodiversity. And then I studied it for a doctorate degree, also in environmental policy, looking mostly at wildlife conservation in the drylands of southern Kenya. I grew up in the rural area, so definitely environment was part of my childhood. But two things that really made me get involved in environment. One is that I saw what was happening in Lake Victoria with the problem of water hyacinth, and it was quite fascinating just how something like that could happen. And that's one of the challenges we have with invasive species that are spreading in our ecosystems. But the other thing is that I had a teacher who actually inspired me to join bird watching, and so that's where I started through the National Museums of Kenya, the Department of Ornithology. I started my journey mostly, I would say, with community work, which then evolved into policy. So as part of my PhD degree, I was working with pastoral communities in the Masai Mara region and also south of Nairobi National Park. And I was actually looking at what kind of incentives enables them to set aside their land, which is outside the protected area, the formal protected area, to allow that for conservation. And over time, when I had my results out, I was actually requested to contribute to a cabinet brief on how conservation of wildlife outside the protected areas can be best done. And so that really is how I got engaged in the policy work. In some cases, policy is ahead. In other cases, policy is lagging behind. And communities are actually driving policy. And perhaps I think because we're talking about optimism, I think one of the silent revolutions that has been happening in Kenya is the way the majority of communities are setting aside their land for conservation. So to give you an example, when I was doing my work in around 2008, 2009, we had just about 45 community conservancies, wildlife conservancies. Now we have about 180 of them. And to just tell you how this is the scale of it, we have about 6.3 million hectares of land that is set aside by the communities for wildlife conservation, which is outside the formal protected areas. So it's outside the national parks and national reserves. So that tells you that communities are actually really driving the agenda for conservation. On the other hand, it took a while before the policy itself was revised to start to accommodate and recognize conservancies as a formal land use. So because the policy process usually takes a bit of a time, it has to go through parliament, and there's a lot of discussions and so on. So in that instance, you see a situation where policy is driven by community action. Other example where policy is ahead is if you want to look at pollution in Kenya. So for example, the government of Kenya has banned single-use plastic. And that was actually a policy going ahead of the science. So it depends on case-by-case basis. But either way, I think you need, for effective results, you need both policy, community, and stakeholders action happening at the same time. A significant work that I'm proud of is on looking at the issue of air quality and air pollution. At the moment, we have public consultations going on the Nairobi County Air Quality Policy. And that work actually resulted from some work that I started to do about 4 years ago with local communities in an informal settlement called Mukuru. And we used, as part of that research actually, we used a citizen science approach. So we basically used low-cost sensors to monitor air pollution with the youth in the community. And because of that, it created such a huge amount of awareness that they were able to start talking to their leadership, in parliament and at the county government. And the county government approached us to support them to develop the policy. And we've been working with them over the last 2.5 years to develop that policy. At the moment, it is actually with the County Assembly for public consultation, and it will be adopted in about 2 or 3 months from now. And after that, we're actually going to support them also to develop an air quality bill and a regulation to go with that. So I point this out because I think the significance of that, if you want to think about biodiversity, is the fact that I'm very passionate about green spaces in urban areas. And you see, that's one of the areas that by having green spaces, you don't just have spaces where people can spend time for recreation, but it's actually, those spaces are very significant spaces for purifying the quality of the air. And if you want to think about Nairobi, over the last 10 years, we've seen massive increase in pollution level because of open air burning, because of traffic, because of industries and so on. So that's the work that I would actually really say I'm really proud of, because it's work that started from science, working with the community, through citizen science approach, to the policy, and now you have a policy results in terms of a policy paper by the government. Two things. One is that it depends on the scale of the problem. If the scale of the problem is so huge, as I talked about plastic, for example, you need a top-down approach. You need a regulation, a policy, a ban, for example, to deal with the problem immediately. But in the long term, actually, you need to think about a process that's bottom-up, driven from by the communities, by the stakeholders on the ground. And I think this is where science also needs to change. Whether you're looking at water pollution, whether you're looking at biodiversity, whether you're looking at forest conservation, I think the way science has been conducted before is not the way science should be conducted moving forward. So taking an approach of citizen science, which really means engaging communities, engaging stakeholders as part of the scientific process, would create a groundswell of citizens who are well-informed, who are passionate about the issues, but who can then take over by leading with solutions. And those solutions can actually be individual solutions. Often people always think about policy as the start and end of everything, but actually a large part of solutions that we need for environment problems starts with us as individuals. So if you think about the air pollution work that I mentioned, I think one of the exciting things is that you start to see, for example, in Nairobi, we now have a very solid community of bicycle association, young people who are just going out there, and every weekend, they are promoting the use of bicycles as a means of transport. You need, of course, therefore, to push the government to make sure that the infrastructure, the roads and so on, are designed to allow people to use bicycle. But that's an individual decision that somebody takes that actually help to contribute to reducing air pollution, but also to reducing emissions for greenhouse gases, which is a big problem for climate change. So I would say that both bottom-up and top-down approaches work, but the circumstances need to be different. But in the long term, obviously bottom-up solutions become very critical. And it needs not just be, I think we also have to think about the different categories of stakeholders. And I think this is where it becomes very important. For example, the work that Tropical Biology Association is doing, you need to train scientists, but you also need to go beyond and train the young people, for example, because they're really, if you look at Africa, the majority of the population are below 25 at the moment. They're a generation that is actually dealing with technology very differently. And so you can actually take advantage, really, of this bulge of population to really drive the science agenda. Not everybody needs to be scientists, but everybody can be involved in science. And by getting involved in science, they can actually contribute to the solutions.